Welcome to Fintech Daydreaming, the podcast that dives into the world of banking technologies and the ever-changing landscape of fintech companies. We bring you real-life examples from global and local thought leaders, as well as experts working within the financial industry, and seek out the best stories from the front lines of financial services innovation, where dreams of industry pioneers meet reality. Hosted by Krogdahl and Ville Sointu. This is Fintech Daydreaming.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Fintech Daydreaming. We are here with my good friend and co-host, Paul Krogdahl, as always. How is life, Paul?
Life is fantastic, Ville. Actually, I've noticed I always answer, life is fantastic. It is. It actually is. I mean, we get to have these fantastic discussions with some of the leading industry brains, right? So, some of the guests we have had have been fantastic or inspiring. And again, I'm really looking forward to today's chat. Yeah. It's an exciting subject.
We are privileged, and it turns out it's easier and easier to get fantastic guests on the show as we get more listeners. And that's, of course, thank you to our dear listeners for spreading the gospel of our podcast. And we are looking forward to extending this to as many ears and eyes as possible. But that's enough about us. We're not going to talk about the weather. So those of the friend of the weather forecast will be disappointed this time around. But we actually want to get to our guest and the topic of today. So today we are joined by Mattias Fras, who is the head of AI Hub at Nordea Bank. So he's a very good colleague and a friend of mine from my favorite bank in the world, Nordea. So Mattias, how are you doing today?
I'm also doing great. I mean, it's a lot of fun to join you guys on this pod and talk about subjects that I love. So it's a great start of the semester, I think.
Yeah, welcome to the podcast. Again, we've been trying to have you on for a long time, and I'm really happy that we finally made this happen together. So Mattias, just for the audience, maybe a brief introduction of you and your background. How did you end up where you are now?
Yes, my background is I started in management consulting a little bit more than 20 years ago. I did that for about a decade or 11, 12 years. I worked across many different industries, worked with change, transformation, digitalization. But then I decided I should try to have a real job and try that. So I joined Nordea in 2011 as a CFO of the Swedish life and pension company, which was quite different from what I did before and also quite different from what I do now. But I did that for a few years, and it was a great experience, and I learned a lot. But then after that, I decided I wanted to go back to consulting or change again, and I took a position in Nordea to drive digitalization in wealth management, and been doing that since. I've been doing consulting in Nordea since about 2014, around mainly the common denominator for the stuff I've done is, I think, around bringing new technology into the organization. So, robotics back in 15, chatbots back in 16, and machine learning, 17 and forward. And since right now I'm acting as the lead for Nordea's AI Hub. Really, and that's really great because that's what I'm passionate about, this new technology.
Yeah, it sounds like I love it when you say that you got a real job and went to work for a bank. So that means that maybe I have a real job as well. But yeah, at least my parents will like it. Now, before we get to the meaty topics of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and all the fun of it, we do have a tradition in the podcast, as our listeners will very well know, which is that we ask the guests to tell a fintech or banking related joke. And we did warn you beforehand, Mattias, that you are allowed to tell a joke now if you want to. So do you have a joke for us today?
I missed that part, unfortunately, but I can tell a joke.
Go ahead.
I mean, you know the difference between when a data scientist talk about AI and when a business guy talk about AI, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know?
Well, I think I know, but I think you have a better answer.
Well, you know, it's when I talk about it, I call it AI, and when they talk about it, they call it you know, they talk in Python, right? So I think it's kind of a description of the hype that's around the whole area right now, and there's so many people that you know don't know what they're talking about, basically, right? So yeah. I think it's a joke, but it's also some truth in it.
Yeah, that's fantastic for our audience who are quite nerdy fintech people, I believe. So that's actually a surprisingly good joke. Usually our jokes are pretty awful in this show, so this is a refreshing change, I think.
Okay, well, thank you.
And that actually leads us into an interesting kind of topic that we want to kind of start with, which is the question of what actually is AI. I mean, as you said, it's pretty much defined by whoever has whatever picture they have in their own head about what is artificial intelligence, and these views vary very I mean quite a bit between business people, technical people, and then people who are actually implementing it on the ground. Now, Mattias, I mean, from your perspective, what actually is AI? And maybe perhaps more interestingly, what is not AI in your perspective?
Yeah, I think currently most things are probably not AI. And even in these solutions that we see now around us, that contain AI, the actual machine learning model in those models are very little part of them. It's mainly digitalization and data related solutions. But I find the question, what is AI, is it's a little bit of a, I think I answer different things every time now. Because on one hand, the AI is just a tool, right? And that's how we use it now. Most of us, it's just a tool that we use for something. But I also like to think of it as almost, to me, it's more like a state of mind. It's more like, because you can use that tool to solve problems in entirely new ways, which is more like a state of mind related. So, you know, I think about it as, you know, you've seen The Matrix, right? Of course, you've seen The Matrix many times because it's the best movie ever made. And you know, the blue pill and the red pill analogy, and I think that, you know, I took the red pill a few years ago because I really want to understand, you know, how can the future, what can the future look like when we have this new technology? You know, what is the matrix? What does it look like? You know, I think it's a pretty good analogy. Of course, I'm by no means nothing like Neo, but in the movie, but you know, it's about finding out what are the possibilities with this new technology and data at hand. And I think, so to me, it's more a way of thinking about problem solving and making it better for humans than just a tool, although that is how we use it. And I should also say that it's very much a distraction. It's very much a problem that we just use that word because it's, you know, you know, we should not focus on that. We should focus on what problems we want to solve, right? So in that sense, I think that maybe we're leaving the highest peak of that hype now, maybe, and realizing that, you know, it's not magic. It's actually a lot of hard work and it's difficult. And, you know, the main difficulty lies in data prep rather than in the models itself. So that's a good thing, I think.
It actually is still quite an emerging technology, right? We've been talking about it for quite some time, but it is still emerging. And I think Hollywood, in a number of movies, you mentioned Matrix and there's many others, where the notion of AI and related technologies are portrayed in a very sinister way. I mean, even Elon Musk, we've spoken about Elon before, has almost negative perspective on AI if AI is not kept under control.
But isn't AI always going to be an emerging technology? I mean, we've been talking about artificial intelligence since the 80s or 70s even.
Yeah.
And it always seems to be something in the horizon, something, which is magical, that cannot be easily explained. So it's artificial intelligence. I think, for example, if you would suddenly drop an iPhone from 2021 into the beginning of the 80s, they would say that this is complete artificial intelligence. Now, of course, we see that it's not actually. There's AI parts in there, but there's nothing to do with AI if you're using an app store, for example. So maybe that's it. It's just.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
It's AI until you do it, and then it's not AI. Then this next thing is the AI, and there's something there. But I would also say that it's really happening, and especially if you look at China, because when you have lots and lots of data, and you have no data integrity and no regulation, you can implement AI. It works, right? So I think that's what we also see there. But in terms of Europe and companies, I would agree that we're not seeing that much yet. So it's mainly China in implementation and US in the sort of innovation.
Yeah. Good. Now let's set one record straight, which is that people tend to talk quite interchangeably about AI, machine learning, and robotics. So what actually is the difference between AI, machine learning, and robotics, Mattias?
Yeah, I don't know how many times we talk about these things, but it's first of all, I think it's easy to distinguish robotics and take that out of the equation. I mean, robotics is basically a script, right? It's a rule-based script. You put it on top of a process to replace a human manual work, but it's entirely based on if then else statements, basically, right? So it's powerful because since 5 years ago, you can use these scripts and work across different domains and applications and platforms. So it kind of works like a human in that sense. That's why they call it a robot, I guess. But it's static and it's rule-based, right? So perfect for these stuff that you usually move offshore or near shore, right? Well documented, repeatable, rule-based, So that's robotics. When we talk about AI and machine learning, I think machine learning is a type of AI. And when we talk about AI in Nordea, it's basically machine learning, right? That's what we use, although there's some other, potential expert systems and some, deep learning applications that are also under the umbrella of AI. So that's how I see it anyway. But AI, if you would ask my chief data scientist, he would say, unless there's a feedback loop and a constantly learning model, then it's not AI. And all the stuff that we do is, human in the loop, more or less, and not sort of self-driving.
Yeah, maybe that's actually a good segue combined with your previous point about the Chinese markets kind of achieving new levels of AI usage in a way. And maybe shifting gears a little bit now, implementing AI machine learning models in a bank. Let's start from the challenges. I mean, compared to the Googles and the Alibabas and the Amazons of the world, how would you describe using AI and these models, these algorithms in a bank? What are the kind of main challenges in a regulated environment like banks when trying to use these new technologies?
I mean, I think that one thing with the bank is that we are quite in a quite regulated environment, as you say, and you can almost say like being policy driven is the opposite of being data driven. Being rule-based and being, machine learning based are like almost like on the opposite sides of the scale. So that and what that I think tells us is the sort of the culture and the mindset and how we think about these things that are, makes it difficult to build trust and to make compliant with existing policies That could go for any company, but especially in heavily regulated companies. So I think that whole cultural and mindset, I think, is the biggest challenge. And I think that when I read a lot about this subject and then listen to a lot of podcasts and other thought leaders and smart people, and I think that's what I pick up now. That's where the biggest challenge is, because we all pretty much have access to cloud, cloud environments. We have the giants and others where you can. There's a lot of there's a lot of models and libraries out there. So it's like you have access to the tech, you have access to data. You might not have the data in the shape and form and quality to apply machine learning, which may be the second biggest challenge, to have your data in order. I think that's, I drive the AI hub, but it probably would make more sense to call it the data enablement for AI hub, because that is what we're mainly focusing on. I think the other thing is around how we, getting your data in the shape, both for exploration, but also to build, sustainable pipelines to run these models. And then there is, there's actually a new regulation. I don't know if you heard, but there's an AI regulation that was proposed back in March, that is talking about, if you want to do AI, it's going to be, it's going to be regulated. Europe is taking a third way. We're not doing China. We're not doing the US, where the big companies are dictating the conditions. We are actually regulating it, and we have GDPR. So there's like, you have to be clever to sort of to do things in a proper way and with these regulations.
I think when I had a look at that regulation, it kind of reminded me that EU is trying to tell everybody to be very responsible and don't be evil with the data that you do. So don't do surveillance and don't do anything related to that. Except if you're authorized by the government to do so. So it was a little bit kind of a double-edged sword in a way. Yeah,
I think it's of course a risk that it will bit suffocate the innovation in Europe. We're already lagging, right? So we are a regulatory superpower in Europe, and now there's another regulation coming in, but also it's. So I think that there are two aspects to that. One is it's good for us because we're good at regulation in Nordea. It's probably tougher for the fintechs or the neobanks or the companies that don't have the resources and the knowledge to work with regulations. And the other thing is that I think I lost my line of thought here. Maybe it'll come back.
Yeah, if it comes back to let us know. But I think this leads into the other part of the question. Now, we talked a lot about the regulation and the challenges in applying AI type of methods in a bank, but what about the opportunities? I mean, we have already seen different implementations of AI in different parts of Nordea and all the other banks as well. So, what do you think, Mattias, are the main development areas today for AI in financial institutions?
I mean, I think there are different dimensions to that question. I think on one end, there is an opportunity for banks to improve the customer interface, to improve employee satisfaction, and to radically increase automation. And a great way to get the look at the possible is to look at the fintechs, right? The fintech companies, they are solving problems, often like niche problems, but if we look at how they solving problem both in the customer interface and across all these domains, I think that there you can see the art of the possible, and so they're showing us what can be done in many different areas, and our challenge then becomes, what problems should we focus on? What problems should we solve as a bank? And I think that is almost like the what's going to be the differentiating factor between the banks now. Who is better at solving the right problems to solve? But I think there's tremendous potential on both, growth, cost savings, risk reduction, and customer experience. I mean, all these things will be improved, and it all depends a little bit where we as a bank want to differentiate. But I think for sure, if you can make it much, the bank will be more invisible for the customer by automating the interface, by taking care of stuff on customer behalf in a much better way. The financial crime space is probably where the banks have advanced the most, right? Including Nordea, the way we work, take data-driven approaches to pick up signals and find fraud and anti-money laundering and stuff like that. So that's an area which will continue to grow. But I also think in terms of being able to predict customer pain points, predict customers who are about to leave, taking care of customers in a much better way is an area. The whole personalization area, I think, is really booming right now across many industries and including banking.
You're right. I mean, there has been predominantly people are looking at AI from use cases at the intersection between the bank or the organization and their customers and consumers. There's companies like Personetics which are doing fantastically interesting things in this space, and the growth of chatbots to a certain degree as an example of this. Another area where I'm seeing growth of AI being used is in the area of IT operations. Actually using AI as a tool to improve the immune system of the IT operations, and utilizing AI capabilities to predict and preempt outages and issues in advance to be able to improve reliability and business resiliency, which is also critically important for a bank, right?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's clearly being able to predict where the next outage is going to be, or where you're weak in your infrastructure. I think those are great use cases.
Yeah, taking a bit of a kind of a customer perspective into this. I mean, you mentioned a couple of interesting things: fraud detection, anti-money laundering purposes, quote unquote churn reduction, or predicting if a customer is about to leave. And Paul talked about the IT security vulnerability scanning and all of those kind of applications. But from a practical standpoint, if I'm a customer of a bank and today I, let's say, log into Nordea's digital channels, is there anything there that's driven by AI that perhaps wasn't there just some years ago?
I think, yeah, I mean, back to how we define AI, I think in terms of using data to provide better experience and more relevant, experience for our customers in the mobile app. I hope that this sort of experience by customers that's much better, the overview and the the relevancy, and you can do more and more stuff. Of course, you have the chatbot in the mobile app, for example, which is an AI application, right? But I think that we have only so far scratched the surface. I think in terms of trigger models, in terms of using data and finding triggers for pushing relevant notifications to customers, I think there we see a lot. Whether that's machine learning or not, usually it may not be, right? So it's a little bit on where you draw the line. But I think but for sure, using data to provide better, more relevant experience in the mobile app and in the internet bank, I think that is clearly improved over the past few years. And I think that's where banks in general, I think in Europe are quite mature, at least in the Nordics, right?
Yeah.
But in terms of AI, I think it will be a while, and then we will see more of the personalization and automation and more invisible things happening for the customer. So you don't have to allocate special, you don't have to do the allocations yourself. You have an AI that does that based on your preferences automatically, for example. I think those kind of things we will see, in the future.
What about the growth of robo-advisors? I mean, everybody is focused on robo-advisors, using them for consumer-based investments, etc. Help our listeners out here. Is that an example of AI, or is that more to your example around robots?
I think robo-advisors can definitely leverage AI machine learning by, much more effectively, process lots of data and make a more personalized portfolio, for example, right? Based on, because a person, a person's needs are seldom, static. You cannot categorize people into 5 different personas. If I think a good example is Netflix, where you have, I don't know, I read about them a while ago, and they have 2,000 or 3,000 micro segments, and you are a combination of 4 of those, and that shapes what you see on the screen. I think if you're able to process a lot of data, you will be able to provide a more unique persona that is actually you. You care about sustainability this much, you have this risk appetite, you have your family situation, your personal interest, and all of that stuff becomes you, and then you get sort of a more tailored portfolio, for example, and you can choose from lots and lots and lots of more sort of underlying assets.
Yeah.
So I think that's where what you will see, and it's interesting then that this can also be done at a very, very low cost, right? So then it gets and that's, I guess that's where we don't see so much in Europe yet, but in the US we see them, right? Those kind of solutions more, and again we have MiFID II, and we have other stuff here that we need to sort of adhere to. So it's not just to go and implement, but you also need to be able to document and explain and be transparent about what you do, right? Which is not so easy when you deal with these complex systems, I guess.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, it goes for all the kind of regulation, right? So we're all used to clicking, for example, cookie notifications off of all the websites and all of that stuff because of different kinds of regulations. It's a whole other question whether those actually are helping anyone. But again, in the securities regulation, which is MiFID, for example, I think it's critical that these consumer protections are in place, and you know what you're investing. So I think in that case, it's a regulation for the good. It's about the implementation that is actually more interesting. But you mentioned that we're kind of just scratching the surface of the potential of AI in financial services. And one of the things that gets mentioned quite often when talking about artificial intelligence applications is the so-called, kind of going beyond things being comfortable. So the kind of creepy line or uncanny valley, basically when you notice that AI is doing something and you feel uncomfortable because you don't really understand what's going on in the background. And I think Facebook, to a certain sense, has reached that a couple of times. You don't always understand why you're seeing something very specific advertising after how you have potentially not ever told anyone that you went to, for example, look at pots and pans or whatever. So that's kind of already in that region. What do you think in banking? I think we reach this much quicker maybe than in social media, because banking is perceived to be so trusted, kind of it's a trust anchor in the society. And I think doing this AI approaches there is more sensitive than perhaps in anywhere else. What do you think as a bank, what the bank should do to avoid this kind of getting customers too scared about AI?
I think that's a very interesting area, and we're actually focusing a little bit on that now because we're working on guidelines for ethical AI and ethics for both data and AI, to be honest. And it is not so clear what should you do? And if you could do it, what should you do? And it's not something that you can just, quickly can decide. And that's why, I mean, that's one of the, I guess, pros of this regulation, that we're not just, jumping too quickly into this, right? The regulation slows us down. And I think in terms of those kind of questions, some companies that are a little bit ahead of us, maybe a couple of years on their AI journey, they have people, they have someone driving, they have like a chief ethics officer, or they have people that are actually focusing on these things. They may have a policy, right? But the policy, we can also have a policy. We can just take World Economic Forum or, Microsoft or Google. They have all good policies, right? It's how you then implement those policies and how you sort of build your culture around them. And I think that's the companies that are a bit ahead of us. I think they are actually sitting down in workshops talking about, these things. I read about H&M, for example, talk about this chatbot, right? That is sort of, becoming your, of course, advisor on clothing, but could also, what if it could also be a lot more than that? Like you could talk about fashion in general, and what if you could sort of talk about, movies, and what you would talk about, you can stretch it, right? How far would you like to stretch it? And, and to get diversity and inclusion into the stuff that you're building, you need to have different people giving their input to these things before you decide what you should do and should not do. So I think these are can be delicate issues, and it's important to really get many people's perspective into these discussions before you decide what is your policy on ethics for data and for AI. And when you have that, you should declare it. I think you should declare it to your customers and say, hey guys, we have a bunch of data. This is how we intend to use it. That builds trust. But I think to get there's a lot of work to be done and long thought process. That was a long answer to your question, but I think it's a tricky area.
Yeah,
there's another dimension to it as well. You're talking about ethics and ethical use of the data, etc. The other dimension to it is cognitive biases, right? And being able to ensure that you don't implement any cognitive driven biases into the algorithms. And that's sometimes even more difficult, because we all bring with us cognitive biases, either because of where we live, how we grew up, etc., etc. How is Nordea dealing with these sort of cognitive biases in their algorithms?
Yeah, I think we have, when we talk about AI and responsible AI is a word now, and the European Commission talks about that, and I think they talk about ethics, they talk about robustness, and they talk about what's the third area? Ethics, robustness, and now I forgot the third one. But anyway, I think we need to deal with all these things. So cognitive bias is one thing. We know that all the data we have, there's if you feed that to an algorithm, there will be like bias in them, right? Because people are taking different decisions. So so we really need to on top of the ethical part, we need to address all these things around privacy, security, diversity, transparency, and bias. And the way we've done it now in Nordea is that we have included it in our playbook or AI lifecycle framework that we have developed, where we have checklists, basically. Have you checked for this? Have you checked for this? Have you checked for this? And I think that that's a really good start. And the next step is, of course, that you need to build that into your tooling. So when you develop your stuff, you need to have these controls built into the tooling, so that you don't rely on the people only, but you also have sort of controls implemented in your systems. I think that's the way to to go in the future. And that's where we're going. So you have both sort of the governance, the controls, the technology to instrument it, and then to train people, of course, on these things.
Yeah, I think what we're witnessing here is one of the kind of commonly known truths about different markets, right? So in the US, they tend to build something first and then figure out if it needs to be regulated or controlled. And in the EU, we regulate everything into existence, for better or worse. And that's why things are moving slowly. But perhaps, especially in questions of ethics and biases, it's better to go a little bit slower. Maybe we'll leave that discussion there for the moment and shift to one of the last topics we had for this episode here, which is the future. So, I mean, from your perspective, I mean, if you would have to take a swing at what's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years in AI development in general, in not only in context of banks, but also in general, what do you think are the major trends that we should be following? And if you make a prediction what the world will look like in 10 years, maybe from a bank perspective, what do you think, Mattias?
All right. First, I just wanted to say I came to think of the third pillar that they talk about.
Go for it.
It's robustness, it is ethical, and it's of course the regulation, right? So it's compliant.
There we go.
So thank you. So I just wanted to make sure that I got that through. No, but the future, I think, I think to me the relevant question is not what will banking look like in 10 years, but what does the world look like now, or what does it look like now? And what is happening now, and kind of just like an AI system, right? We as humans need to take the approach that we are constantly learning. Instead of pretend that we know stuff now, we need to learn stuff now. There's this Microsoft CEO, Satya something, I can always forget his name, but he's saying, don't be a know-it-all, be a learn-it-all. I think that's a really good quote. I use it often. And it is, the way I think about it is that if we understand what's going on now with the platforms, with the data, with the technology and our problems, if we can if we can say that we want to be ready for whatever the future looks like in 10 years, that is what we should do, right? So that means that we need to think smart about how we architect, how we what tech stack, how we stacking our company, what partnerships we do, how we solve our integrations towards the ecosystem. So whatever it looks like, we can be agile and we can adjust to that and be successful there. I think that's what we should focus on. And I do think that it will be more, and that's not so just me, but it will be more ecosystem. It will be more connected. Some banks will be more of infrastructure provider. They will say, we lost the customer interface. Fintechs or whatever is taking care of that. We just provide the bank for the banking platform on which they can build their applications on top of and be relevant for the customer. It's a nice, it's not a very profitable business, but it's a nice business to be in. Some banks will be more niche, and some banks will be still full service like we are now. But that means that you need to be, really smart about how you play on all these kind of fields, both in terms of the, personalization, customer interface in your backend, and how you were improving your services. So that was just thinking out loud, not a very concrete future picture. I do think that we will not have personal banking business, we will not have these divisions anymore. We will have like sales, we will have operations, and we will have some support functions, but we will be organized around the data rather than around some something else. That's what I think.
So making that transition from product centricity to client centricity in a true
entirely client centric.
Yes,
exactly.
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, we've talked about on the podcast this season before. We talked about moving from products to outcomes, and I think this speaks perfectly to that same thing, right? So it's about the outcomes you provide as a bank and how you become part of the kind of workflows of your customers. We had interesting discussions before this season about these things as well, and couldn't agree with you more, Mattias. I mean, anybody who predicts the future, you're fine doing that as long as you understand that you're probably wrong and you should be learning and adjust your kind of future views accordingly, and don't kind of always say that I'm always right. So you have to be able to admit that I predicted wrong. But I think that's this kind of a learning approach for your career and the entire life, I guess, is a good approach for any company or person.
We even had an episode with a reluctant futurist, right, who told us that no one can predict the future.
That's right. Anybody who does is probably lying.
But you know, maybe the best thing that, you know, senior leaders can have now is the sense of is to let go of the, you know, I know everything. But it's a hard thing, right? If you've been in a bank for 40, 30, 20, 30 years, it's difficult to admit, you know, I don't have all the answers. And I think that goes for every industry. But that is, if we can crack that one, I think that then we will also get a long way.
There is a danger for the banking industry. If you think about it, it's been the same since beginning of time.
Yeah.
Right? So to senior bankers who have been in the bank, like you said, for a very long time, they don't even recognize the need for change. I mean, it is the true Kodak moment. We talk about this all the time, but there is fundamental shifts coming now that is going to change the way banks operate and what the banking industry looks like.
Yes, and I think, we talked about this before as well, but I think the interesting to look at what happened in the mobile operator space, for example. They were afraid to death that they will become dumb pipes because of all the application companies that will provide all the application, that they just provide the data connectivity. But look at the mobile operators today. I think most of them, the successful ones at least, have reinvented themselves. They do not kind of compete with the big techs. They have found their position in this world, and I think the similar thing might be in front of banks as well as we move forward, and the regulation is more advanced in the future as well.
So what do you guys? So how you see the future of banking, Ville? What do you? If I ask you that question, what does Nordea look like in 10 years?
I actually subscribe to the same idea as you do. I think the banks will move to be outcome based, at least the successful ones. So combining many of the things in terms of understanding risk management and handing out credit, for example, optimizing those processes so that we can deploy credit where it's needed and do it in a kind of a risk managed way. Without talking about what type of loan or anything like this, just being able to deploy capital where it's needed and handle transactions practically in real time with zero or low risk. I think that's the kind of future of banking. Now, beyond that, there can be banks for different segments. I think the concept of one bank serving every customer segment is probably going to be a little bit outdated. So we will see more banks focusing on certain segments and then providing services to maybe fintechs or third parties in the future for the segments that are better served using a partnership approach, perhaps. So maybe that's a rounded way of making a prediction. Thanks for the question, Mattias. Paul, you want to take a swing?
Yeah, but I know that you think about these things as much as I do. So yeah, it's good that we're quite aligned then.
Yeah, very good. So Paul, you want to take a swing at that question?
I can indeed, but I think everybody out there knows my perspective, right? I've been very vocal on this. I truly believe the future of banking will be dominated by platforms. I think we're seeing the platformification of the banking industry. I think it's going to be ecosystem centric, and very much like we've said, it is going to be outcome based rather than output based. I have this notion that I talk about around the data enabled client, right? I think that using AI capabilities, changing to a more agile way of engaging customers in their true customer journeys, we are going to see a very different model emerging going forwards.
Great. And on that note, time flies when you're having fun, and it certainly has flown this time. I can't believe we spent so much time already. So it's time to wrap it up for this episode of Fintech Daydreaming. And as always, we will do that by asking Mattias, how can our listeners get in touch with you to continue the discussion if there's anything on AI and banking that they want to talk about?
Yeah, they can talk about, LinkedIn is the best way, I think. Mattias Fras, I think I'm the only Mattias Fras in the world, so it's easy to find.
Okay, good stuff. So again, thank you for coming on, Mattias. It was a pleasure having you. Maybe we'll have you on next time when we have something new, fantastic happening in AI and banking. But with that, it's time to ask our listeners to please, if you see that subscribe button in your podcast player or your YouTube channel that you're watching right now, please hit the subscribe button. And if you like what you heard, also give us a review, preferably 5 stars. It will really help our new listeners to find our podcast who are interested in fintech. So with that, Paul and I will say goodbye. We will see you in 2 weeks' time with another episode of Fintech Daydreaming. This has been Fintech Daydreaming.
This is Fintech Daydreaming.